Welcome to Zitron Squeeze, where we pressure test AI's promises, economics, and human costs. A tool that helps debug a crash log can be useful. A trillion-dollar industry built around the promise that it will eventually think, work, and decide for us deserves a far harder audit. The question isn't whether language models can do anything, it's whether their demonstrated value matches the certainty, spending, and social pressure surrounding them. The strongest version of the skeptical case starts with a concession. LLMs can be genuinely handy in controlled jobs. They can search a document set, turn a narrow request into a short script, help inspect logs, or generate specialized query code. Those are bounded tasks with an operator who can check the answer. The model supplies a draft, retrieval aid, or interface layer. A human still owns the outcome. As the task gets broader, reliability becomes much harder to measure. Code edits can be inconsistent. A model may introduce changes the user didn't request, remove working pieces, and produce confident explanations that sound plausible without establishing that they're true. That creates a serious dividing line for healthcare, finance, mental health, and any setting where a wrong answer harms a person. The argument here is better supported than sweeping claims of imminent autonomy. Usefulness in constrained work does not establish dependable judgment in open-ended work. There is still an unresolved practical question. Many tools become valuable through workflow design rather than raw capability. The burden is on vendors and buyers to show that the workflow's checking costs, failure costs, and maintenance costs remain lower than the value it creates. That boundary also frames the ethical critique. Delegating a repetitive, bounded operation differs from delegating research, prose, conclusions, or responsibility, and then presenting the output as your own understanding. The concern isn't purity. Plenty of tools shape writing and programming. The concern is whether the person publishing the chart, recommendation, article, or vibe-coded application can explain what it says, how it works, and where it may fail. Embarrassment around undisclosed AI use may reflect that distinction, though it's imperfect evidence. People also fear stigma, workplace rules, and accusations of cutting corners. Still, audiences have a reasonable expectation that a named author or developer has exercised judgment over the finished work. Vibe-coded software sharpens the stakes because users inherit risks they can't inspect. A prototype can be valuable. A production system handling money, identity, health, or safety needs review, testing, ownership, and a clear path for fixing failures. The broader claim is that AI currently works exceptionally well as a financial narrative. Attach the label to a product, a cloud build-out, a stock, or a consulting deck, and future demand can be priced into the present. That doesn't prove fraud or prove demand is imaginary. Infrastructure cycles often begin ahead of revenue. The real issue is scale and timing. How much eventual revenue is required, who bears today's losses, and whether customers will pay enough to cover the full cost of compute. The source points to high borrowing costs at CoreWeave, reported chip price increases from NVIDIA, and a reported collaboration involving Sharon AI, whose revenue was tiny relative to the headline figure. Taken individually, such examples are warning signals rather than a complete balance sheet analysis. Taken together, they describe a system where suppliers capture demand while many downstream buyers and labs carry enormous capital and operating burdens. BCA Research's cited estimate of $10 trillion in annual AI revenue needed to justify data center investment is especially consequential if its assumptions hold. The competing claim that the addressable market may be closer to $30 billion shows the gap at issue. These estimates are models, not settled facts, yet the gap is large enough that investors should demand transparent assumptions rather than slogans about transformation. The same discipline applies to claims that intelligence is getting cheaper. A lower price per token says little by itself. Stronger models can use far more tokens, and an agentic workflow may make repeated calls, retries, tool uses, and long context passes before producing an answer. For a customer, the meaningful number is the cost of completing a useful task at an acceptable error rate. That number can rise even as a benchmark price falls. Predictability matters too, because a business can budget a seat license more easily than an opaque variable inference bill. The source alleges steep subsidies at major labs and sites reported OpenAI training spending and worsening non-GAAP operating margins. Those figures need independent verification and definitions, particularly because private company finances and non-GAAP measures can be selective. Even so, the core economic question is unavoidable. Can recurring revenue eventually fund training, inference, power, depreciation, and financing? An OpenAI report reportedly found no statistically significant relationship between employee AI use and revenue per employee. That result does not mean AI produces zero value. Revenue per employee is a blunt measure, adoption can be shallow, and benefits may appear in quality or speed. It does weaken the easy story that broad usage automatically becomes measurable business performance. The most forceful political criticism compares society's willingness to spend hundreds of billions on machines with its reluctance to fund healthcare, education, mentorship, labor standards, social services, unions, and workplace dignity. That comparison involves values as much as economics. Private capital can deploy money differently from public institutions, and investment in data centers does create construction and supply chain activity. Yet incentives matter. Returns from scalable infrastructure are easier to capture than the diffuse returns from healthier, better supported people. The critique of workers labeled quiet quitters makes that asymmetry vivid. Employees can be criticized for limiting themselves to assigned paid work, while executives and founders often receive patience for costly experiments and grand forecasts. The question is, whose risk gets treated as ambition and whose restraint gets treated as failure? AI data centers also raise a concrete constraint beyond valuation. Announcements measured in hundreds of megawatts or over a gigawatt imply enormous requirements for power, land, grid connections, construction capacity, and financing. These facilities may eventually find uses, yet their specialization and scale make the dot-com comparison incomplete. A surplus of generic internet capacity and a surplus of expensive AI compute create different recovery paths. The industry's favored language often lives in the future tense. Annualized run rates, recursive improvement, exponential gains, AGI, and transformative potential. Those terms can describe real aspirations. They also move attention away from current reliability, current margins, current demand, and current willingness to pay. Conflating LLMs with robotics, autonomous vehicles, and general intelligence makes that accounting even harder. Progress in one field does not automatically validate revenue or capability claims in another. Clear categories would help everyone evaluate what has actually been achieved. Critics should keep their own forecasts accountable too. The source's author acknowledges wrongly predicting OpenAI's death by the end of 2025, after underestimating hyperscalers' willingness to fund and depend on leading labs. That admission matters because it identifies a real counterforce. Financial support can sustain a business longer than a narrow operating model suggests. Sustaining it longer still doesn't answer the endpoint. The cycle can continue while funding, debt capacity, power, construction, and demand hold together. It becomes fragile when one of those inputs slows before revenue catches up. For users, the lived experience may be less dramatic and more tiring. Model changes, shifting rate limits, revised pricing, disappearing features, degraded outputs, and workflows rebuilt around the latest release. The source calls the resulting treadmill Jarvising endless prompts, harnesses, plugins, databases, and assistants that create the sensation of momentum while adding another layer to maintain. That can be productive in particular cases. It can also become elaborate avoidance of the harder work of defining a problem and making a decision. A mature market would make this easier. Stable products, legible pricing, published failure rates, clear responsibility, and evidence tied to specific tasks. Until then, curiosity is warranted, caution is warranted, and neither boosterism nor blanket dismissal does the listener's thinking for them. That's Zitron Squeeze. Keep the useful tool, inspect the promise, and ask who pays when the future tense meets a real invoice. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at Podkey. Anchor.fm.